this is the great stumbling block. Before they can go on with their ambitious plan, they have to get rid of me. And they always try. They work very hard. I think I mentioned, too, earlier, and I should have gone back to it, was that when I filed this $100 million suit in the federal court in Washington, D.C., down at 3rd and Pennsylvania Avenue, Judge Harold Green was placed in charge of it. Well, I didn't know it at this time, but I found out later that Green, a very secretive individual, was a German Jew named Grunhaus. His name was Hein Grunhaus. And he came to the United States in 1943. Well, Jews were not allowed to immigrate in 1943, so he must have been sent over here as a double agent. And so he promptly joined the United States Army, and he and Henry Kissinger and a bunch of other communists went back to Germany as the occupation army. They didn't participate in the fighting. They waited until people like Audie Murphy had won all the battles and the war was over. Then in comes this influx of these people, a horde of refugees who became the occupation government of Germany. And Kissinger had the code name of Bohr as an official Soviet agent, which has been printed many times. He's never denied it. And one of his chief assistants was Grunhaus, who now called himself Green. I don't think he even changed his name legally. They don't bother. Don't have to. So Green came back and joined the Justice Department. He authored the Voting Rights Act of 1950, the Civil Rights Act, and became one of the most influential people in Washington. So they made him first a Superior Court judge, and then Lyndon Johnson put him on the federal court in Washington. So he was my judge, and he promptly dismissed my suit without a hearing. And so I took it to the appeals court of District of Columbia, and there was another judge named Lawrence Silberman, also Jewish, and he promptly upheld Grunhaus's dismissal of my suit. He had been appointed by Nixon, Silberman. He's still there. So Grunhaus had given one interview in his life, and in that interview, which I found, he admitted his name was Grunhaus, and he now called himself Harold Green. And this was the only time that he ever gave an interview throughout his whole career. He died 2 years ago. So here, Heinz Grunhaus, a German refugee, is dismissing my suit without a hearing because he didn't want me to have a hearing. I have been denied jury trial in every lawsuit I've ever filed in this country. Every time. And the Constitution guarantees you a jury trial. And I stipulated at every court case I ever filed that I would have a jury trial. I've never had one to this day. Because the judges feel like they can do what they want to. And as Jerry Spence said, there is no justice in any American court for any American today. And it's true. Go to court and see how much justice you get. I had a friend named Tom Donahue, and I started him in a radio program. And he's a refugee today. He's on the lam. I haven't heard from him for some years. Because he went before Judge Barefoot Sanders in Texas, and Sanders would not even allow him. He would only give him 10 minutes to present his own defense. And it was a trumped-up charge. And so they sentenced him to 8 years, and then they allowed him to walk away because they didn't want to keep him anyway. So he's hiding out somewhere here in California, probably. I couldn't say where, but I haven't had feelings out here. And I've had a lot of people who had to go on the lam. Tupper Saucy was another friend of mine. He was on the lam for 5 years. Finally came back and did a year in Atlanta, and he's out now. But these people thought they would go to court and get justice. They didn't know there was no justice there. You can't get something they don't have. And you can't bring it in with you. So Tom Donahue, after I started him in this radio program, he became the biggest promoter of my books. And so I was on talk shows for 5 hours a day there in Florida, 3 hours with Chuck Harder. They ran Chuck out of business because he had me on. Has no program today. I did 3 hours with Chuck Harder and 2 hours with Tom Donahue. And Tom Donahue used to introduce me on his program as J. Edgar Hoover designated me the most dangerous man in America. And so, which he did for years. And so Rush Limbaugh was growing very rapidly at that time, and he had the program immediately following Tom Donahue. So he would listen to Tom, introducing me as the most dangerous man in America. So Rush appropriated the title for himself. He began to advertise all over the United States, Rush Limbaugh, the most dangerous man in America. And of course, Rush was about as dangerous as a carrot, you know. No threat to anybody. But he used that for a couple of years, and he finally dropped it because it was so ridiculous that he couldn't carry it on any longer. But they put Tom Donahue out of business because he was on the program for hours a day saying, you've got to get Eustace Mullins' books, and talking about the Federal Reserve book and my other books. And they were selling them like hotcake, and Chuck Harder was too. So they sent a reporter down from New York to take care of Chuck Harder. And the way he did it, he came to Chuck and he lied. He said, we want to do a big spread on you in the New York Times. And he wasn't even with the New York Times. He was a Nation correspondent. And but Chuck didn't know that, didn't check him out. And Chuck thought, boy, I'm going to have a big spread in the New York Times. This is going to be great. And so he invited the guy into his hotel there and wined and dined him and showed him all of his operation, let him go through his files. So the guy goes back and writes a series of articles. The main thrust was that Chuck Harder was a tool of Eustace Mullins, and that I was using Chuck to promote my books, and that Chuck was the sucker for doing this. So, of course, it was a total double cross because I had no influence over Chuck Harder at all. He only sold my books because he made money off of them, and he was making good money. But so I said to Chuck, I called him up, I said, look, I can refute everything that is in these articles about my being anti-Semitic and so forth. I said, as I've said on your program, I said, they call me anti-Semitic because I go along with the Orthodox Jewish position, which is that there can be no Jewish kingdom on earth until their Messiah comes. And they don't acknowledge Christ as Messiah. Orthodox Jewish position, which is that there can be no Jewish kingdom on earth until their Messiah comes. And they don't acknowledge Christ as Messiah. And so the Rothschilds, after they began to make a lot of money, they decided to start their own Jewish movement, and they called it the Reformed Jews. They hired a guy named Rabbi Moses Hess in Germany, and they put millions of dollars behind him, and Reformed Jewishness became a very big thing in the Jewish community. But there was always a great battle between the Orthodox Jews, who they were the only true believers, and the Reformed Jews, who only believed in money and power and having a Jewish kingdom, which would be at the crossroads of the world next to the oil fields. The whole idea behind putting Israel, the Jewish nation, in the Middle East was to eventually seize the oil fields. And that's what the new program is. They're starting the Crusades over again. The Crusades started in 1279, and there were 8 Crusades, and the Christians won the first Crusade very handily. They beat the Muslims, and they took over Jerusalem. Then they got homesick and went home, so the Muslims came back and took Jerusalem again. And then 5 more times, the Crusaders came back, and each time the Muslims beat them because they'd learned how to fight them. So we only won the first Crusade, so when you talk about a crusade between 1,900,000 Christians and 1 billion Muslims, obviously the Christians outnumber them and should win, but the fact is that they don't know how to fight in the Middle East, and they never will learn. And the Israelis only fight in the Middle East by terrorism. That's the only thing they know. And so that's how they've survived this long, with American armaments and terrorism. But when George W. announced this new crusade, it was to be that we were going to attack 34 Muslim nations and destroy them in order to end the threat of terrorism. It sounded like a pretty good program. And for the military-industrial complex, it was a great program. We're going to fight 34 nations for the next 100 years, the 100 Years' War. I think George W. Thought of himself as going down in history as the hero of the next 100 Years' War. And that was the foreign policy of the United States. A policy which is so insane you wouldn't think a 4-year-old child would embrace it. And even today, it's the only foreign policy we have. We have no other foreign policy. And of course, our foreign policy should be how to get along with other nations. Instead, what we have is a foreign policy run by lunatics who want to make every nation in the world our enemy. And the rest of the world is not particularly interested in being the enemy of America. They still dream of America. All over the world, people dream of coming to the United States. Not because the streets are paved with gold. They know that's not true any longer. But the gold is in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But it's a place of opportunity. And what other countries do not have is opportunity. And because they have no opportunity, they have no chance to improve their standing, to improve their income. There's no place there that they can do this. So all they can do is immigrate, and immigrate to only one place. Nobody wants to immigrate to China. Nobody wants to immigrate to Africa. They want to immigrate to the United States. This is the only country in the world that everybody else in the world dreams about. Because and that's understandable, but at the same time, you and I living here know that it's up to us to always fight for this country and to keep it a country that is the envy of the world. And this is our great task. And this is what we can do, and we will do, because we understand it's our duty and our responsibility. We fought 2 world wars, which were totally staged, as I say, to knock out German industrial capacity. And they had the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution was perpetrated not only to rob the Tsar, but to put Russia back in the Dark Ages, to eliminate Russia with its natural resources as a competitor in the modern world. So what communism did was to put Russia back 100 years. In other words, the Russians are in 1880 and it's 1980. So they're 100 years out of this, they're out of the competition. Because any nation, when they get a modern economy and a good workforce, can actually become a great threat to every other country in the world. China is no threat to us because it's a communist country and they're controlled and they're inundating us with their mass-produced products, but that's because of our government's policy. It's not China's policy. This comes out of Washington. Why did President Clinton cultivate the Japanese and accept millions of dollars in bribes for them? Because the program was to destabilize and destroy the United States. That's what's going on. And what is George W.'s policy? Practically the same thing. He's doing nothing to improve the economic prospects of this country. In fact, the only thing he's doing is to carry on the war against terrorism, which means you have loonies like these 2 guys in O'Hara that attacked me the other day, and all they're doing is creating dissension, and people hate to go on the airlines because they realize they've got to go through these roadblocks to get on, and it's just not worth the trouble. So they're fighting this country. Your battle is coming right out of Washington. The battle against America is coming right out of Washington. It's not coming out of China. And if it's a battle against America, what is it? It's a conspiracy, and that's why you're here, to find out about the conspiracy. They could not do this without a conspiracy. If one person in Washington would stand up and say, I stand for America, see what the bumper stickers they put out, they say, you stand behind this country, stand behind the USA. They don't say, we stand in front of the USA, we stand behind. And because they're behind, we're behind. And that's where we are today. Language is very important.